the world, and it just took another dangerous turn. A Venezuelan warship rammed a U.S. Navy destroyer, and it feels less like some sudden eruption of chaos and more like, well, the next chapter in something that's been brewing for a very long time. A confrontation between declining empires and restless nations seeking independence from Western dominance. Now, this isn't about one ship, one sea, or one skirmish. It's about a shifting world order. Washington's influence across Latin America, once absolute, now meets open defiance. Economic sanctions, oil diplomacy, the struggle for multipolar power, they've all collided in the waters of the Caribbean. And the question isn't just who struck first. It's why this moment was inevitable. The global balance of power is changing, morality is being tested, and nations once silenced are finding their voice. What we're witnessing here, it's not a random act of aggression. It's history reminding America that the world no longer moves by its command. You see, history rarely announces itself with fireworks. It creeps in quietly through small cracks in the old order until one day something breaks. The Venezuelan warship ramming that U.S. destroyer, it may look at first glance like a sudden eruption of chaos, an impulsive act by a smaller nation defying the world's most powerful navy. But the truth, as always, lies beneath the surface. This wasn't born overnight. It's the culmination of decades of resentment, sanctions, resource wars, ideological struggle, the inevitable moment when suppressed sovereignty collides with imperial certainty. For years, Latin America has existed in the shadow of U.S. policy, a region defined not by its own aspirations, but by the will of Washington. Since the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, America has viewed the Western Hemisphere as its exclusive sphere of influence. From Guatemala to Chile, Panama to Venezuela, interventions have come cloaked in the language of freedom, but carried out in the name of control. And Venezuela, with its vast oil reserves, was always too strategic, too rich, and too defiant to be left alone. When Hugo Chavez rose to power in the late 1992, he symbolized something far larger than just a populist leader. He represented a rejection of American hegemony in Latin America. His vision of Bolivarian socialism, whatever its flaws, spoke directly to the deep wounds of colonialism and inequality. For Washington, however, this was intolerable. What followed wasn't merely diplomatic pressure. It was a full-blown economic siege, sanctions that crippled Venezuela's financial system, isolation that deepened its crisis, and a campaign of narrative warfare designed to delegitimize its government at every turn. Fast forward to today, and that tension has reached its breaking point. The collision at sea, the Venezuelan frigate striking a U.S. destroyer, it's not just a naval incident, it's the manifestation of accumulated rage, of a nation pushed to the edge by years of economic warfare. The official U.S. narrative describes it as an unprovoked act of aggression, but within Caracas, it's being celebrated as an act of defense. A statement that Venezuela will no longer bow to an empire that has starved its people under the guise of democracy. Now, if you step back and look at this from a broader geopolitical lens, this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the crumbling credibility of American power. For most of the post-war era, the U.S. Navy has been the unchallenged symbol of that power, patrolling global waters as a floating declaration of supremacy. Yet, what happens when a smaller state, under economic siege, dares to confront that supremacy head-on? The answer lies not in the outcome of the confrontation, but in its symbolism. The world is watching, and what they see is that the once untouchable order can now be defied, and that defiance, however small, resonates across continents. Consider this. The same week as the Prof incident, both Russia and China issued carefully worded statements calling for stability and dialogue, while quietly increasing their naval cooperation with Latin American partners. This is no coincidence. Both nations understand that Latin America is the Achilles heel of U.S. influence, a region close to home, yet increasingly beyond Washington's control. The Venezuelan strike, while seemingly isolated, becomes part of a larger pattern, one in which the global South is no longer content to live under the economic dictates of the North. But let's not romanticize this as some heroic act of resistance. War, or even the spark of war, is never noble. What's tragic is that it could have been avoided. The U.S. and Venezuela could have rebuilt diplomatic bridges, could have negotiated economic normalization, could have redefined their relationship in the context of a multipolar world. Instead, ideology triumphed over pragmatism. America continued to treat Venezuela as a failed state to be fixed, not as a sovereign nation to be respected. And Venezuela, cornered and impoverished, responded with desperate defiance. A defiance that now risks igniting something far larger than either side intended. The irony here is profound. The United States, once the architect of global stability, now finds itself at the center of a web of instability of its own making. By weaponizing the global financial system, by using sanctions as instruments of coercion rather than diplomacy, it has alienated nations across the global South. These countries may not all align with each other politically, but they share one sentiment: fatigue. Fatigue from the presumption that Washington alone defines what is right and what is legitimate. The Venezuelan strike becomes, in their eyes, a metaphor, the collision of two worlds, one fading, one rising. And yet beneath the headlines, beneath the military jargon and the political spin, there is a human story here. The sailors aboard both ships, Americans and Venezuelans alike, are not enemies by nature. They are young men and women drawn into a confrontation scripted by politics far above their command. One can imagine the moment. The Venezuelan captain, tense, convinced that his nation's dignity is at stake. The American commander, equally convinced he is defending freedom of navigation. Two ships, two narratives, one collision. And in that instant, decades of diplomatic failure burst to the surface. What happens next will define more than U.S.-Venezuelan relations. It will test the moral compass of the international community. If Washington responds with escalation, deploying more warships, imposing new sanctions, or even threatening intervention, it will confirm the fears of many nations that America no longer leads by example, but by force. If, however, it responds with restraint, with genuine diplomacy, it could signal a new chapter, one in which dialogue replaces dominance. The question is whether the United States, in this fragile moment of transition, still has the humility to choose peace over pride. You know, when we talk about power, we often imagine it as a military equation. Ships, missiles, budgets, alliances. But real power, the kind that defines history, is moral. It's about legitimacy, trust, and the perception of justice. The United States, for much of the 20th century, wielded not only unmatched military force, but also moral authority. It positioned itself as the defender of liberty, the champion of human rights, the architect of international law. Even when it stumbled, that moral claim gave it an aura that no empire before it possessed. Yet, in the eyes of much of the world today, that aura has faded. The Venezuelan confrontation is not just a test of America's might, it is a test of its moral identity. Ask yourself, why would a small, struggling nation like Venezuela risk everything by ramming a U.S. destroyer? It wasn't madness, it wasn't mere bravado, it was the raw expression of desperation and defiance, born of decades of humiliation. When a people are cornered, stripped of economic sovereignty, denied access to global markets, and told that their suffering is the price of democracy, they eventually reach a breaking point. Venezuela's leadership may have chosen a reckless path, but the roots of that decision lie in a world order where Washington's economic dominance leaves little room for political independence. This is what I call the morality trap of American foreign policy. The U.S. believes it acts for noble reasons to uphold democracy, to defend human rights. But too often, it imposes those ideals selectively, weaponizing them to protect strategic interests. Sanctions meant to pressure a government end up starving a population. Interventions meant to promote stability leave nations fractured and resentful. The moral narrative collapses under the weight of hypocrisy, and when morality becomes a tool rather than a principle, legitimacy dies quietly, replaced by fear, compliance, and ultimately rebellion. Venezuela's act, then, is not isolated. It's part of a broader awakening. Across the global south, from Africa to Southeast Asia, from the Middle East to Latin America, nations are beginning to reclaim their agency. They no longer see the Western liberal order as synonymous with progress. They see it as a system designed to preserve the dominance of a few and the dependency of the many. The ramming of the U.S. destroyer is a signal, loud and unmistakable, that the era of unipolar morality is over. The United States can no longer dictate the meaning of freedom while denying others the right to define it for themselves. Now, this is where the story becomes more profound, because what we are witnessing is not just a geopolitical shift, but a civilizational one. For 500 years, global power has been Western, first European, then American. That power was built not only on conquest, but on the idea that the West possessed a superior moral compass. But history has a rhythm. Civilizations rise, grow arrogant, lose empathy, and decay not from external attack, but from internal moral exhaustion. The collision off the Venezuelan coast is, symbolically, the sound of that exhaustion breaking the surface. Look at the U.S. from within. The American people are tired of endless wars, tired of global policing, tired of seeing their tax dollars fund conflicts that bring neither security nor prosperity. The country's infrastructure crumbles, inequality deepens, and yet military budgets grow. The idea of America as the indispensable nation once inspired pride. Now, for many, it feels like a burden. And yet Washington's foreign policy establishment remains trapped in a Cold War mindset, seeing every act of defiance not as a reflection of legitimate grievances, but as a threat to be contained. The result is an America increasingly isolated not by geography, but by its own hubris. Consider how differently this moment could have unfolded. Imagine a United States that looked at Venezuela not as a rival to be punished, but as a partner to be engaged. Imagine if Washington had lifted sanctions in exchange for transparency, offered trade rather than embargo, dialogue rather than threats. The Caribbean could have become a sea of cooperation, not confrontation. But diplomacy, shaped by habit and ideology, rarely imagines such possibilities. The U.S. too often seeks submission, not partnership. And in doing so, it undermines the very moral authority that once distinguished it from empires past. It's crucial to remember, power doesn't vanish overnight. It erodes slowly, in the quiet moments when credibility is lost. The fall of empires is rarely about defeat on the battlefield. It's about loss of faith. When allies begin to doubt, when adversaries stop fearing, when global institutions no longer look to Washington for leadership, that's when decline becomes irreversible. The Venezuelan strike, in that sense, is not the cause of America's loss of moral capital. It is the symptom. The rest of the world sees an America unsure of itself, clinging to old doctrines in a new era. And yet, decline is not destiny. History is filled with moments when nations redefine themselves not through dominance, but through humility. The United States could still choose to be a moral superpower, one that leads by example rather than coercion, but that would require a profound shift in consciousness, a willingness to see the world not as an arena of rivals, but as a community of equals. The Venezuelan event could be that catalyst, a mirror forcing America to confront what it has become and what it still aspires to be. Let's talk for a moment about the media narrative. Within hours of the collision, headlines across the Western world painted a predictable picture: Venezuelan aggression, threat to maritime security, defense of freedom of navigation. But what you rarely hear is the context, the years of sanctions that paralyzed Venezuela's oil exports, the freezing of its overseas assets, the deliberate attempt to isolate it from the international banking system. You rarely hear about how economic warfare can be as devastating as military conflict, how it creates suffering that festers into resentment. The American public deserves better, deserves a journalism that asks why nations rebel, not just how they do. For now, the question facing Washington is one of restraint. Does it respond with force, reasserting its dominance through military might, or does it seize this moment to rethink its place in the world? Retaliation would bring temporary satisfaction, but long-term isolation. Dialogue, on the other hand, would demand courage. The courage to admit that the era of command and control geopolitics is over. It's not weakness to negotiate, it's wisdom. and wisdom in a nuclear-armed, interconnected world is the only true strength. Every major geopolitical crisis has two layers, the surface drama and the invisible tide beneath it. On the surface, the collision between a Venezuelan warship and a U.S. destroyer seems like a regional flare-up. But beneath that, deep currents are shifting the entire foundation of the global order. The real story is not about the damage to a ship. It is about the slow erosion of a system that has defined world power for 75 years. We are living through the unraveling of the unipolar age, the end of the world that emerged after 1945 and reached its zenith in the 1,990 seconds. For decades, the U.S. dollar, the U.S. Navy, and U.S. diplomacy worked in perfect harmony. The dollar financed the global economy, the Navy guaranteed the sea lanes, diplomacy translated military might into moral narrative, but now all three pillars are trembling. The dollar faces quiet rebellion as nations explore trade in yuan, rubles, or their own currencies. The Navy, once unchallenged, now meets resistance not just from China's fleets or Russia's submarines, but from smaller nations asserting sovereignty. And diplomacy, once America's proudest export, has hardened into sanction and ultimatum. The Venezuelan ramming is the symptom of that fatigue. The symbolism is haunting. In one instance, steel meets steel, and the ocean bears witness to history's turning point. For half a century, the U.S. Navy has been a metaphor for global order, power, precision, predictability. To see it struck by a Latin American vessel is to glimpse a reversal of psychological gravity. The empire no longer commands the automatic deference it once did. What follows this realization will shape the century. Will the U.S. adapt to a world of equals, or will it cling to a world that no longer exists? Look at the players circling this crisis. Beijing and Moscow understand that time is on their side. China sees Latin America as a frontier of soft power offering loans, infrastructure, and technology without lectures about governance. Russia, haunted by its own sanctions, recognizes in Venezuela a kindred spirit. Each sees the incident as an opening, not a threat. The more Washington isolates Caracas, the more others move in to fill the void. This is how empires lose influence, not through invasion, but through exhaustion and substitution. Consider, too, how this event echoes through global markets. Oil prices surge, the dollar wavers. Investors rush to safe havens. For years, sanctions have weaponized the dollar. Now that weapon boomerangs. Countries watch nervously and wonder, if Washington can freeze Venezuela's assets today, what prevents it from freezing ours tomorrow? The answer is nothing. That fear becomes motivation, and motivation becomes movement toward alternatives, toward a multipolar financial system that no longer depends on Wall Street or Washington. The Venezuelan crisis thus accelerates what economists have long predicted, the slow de-Americanization of global finance. Yet amid these macro shifts lies something more profound, the moral dimension. Every generation faces a test of conscience. For the post-war world, it was the Holocaust and the creation of the United Nations. For our generation, it is the question of whether power can ever again be exercised with humility. When smaller nations resist domination, do we listen or do we punish? When our ideals collide with their realities, do we compromise or do we coerce? The answers will determine not only America's place in the world, but humanity's capacity to coexist without catastrophe. Let's imagine for a moment the conversations happening right now in Washington. The Pentagon wants deterrence, a show of strength. The State Department pleads for calm, knowing that escalation could spiral. The intelligence community debates whether the incident was deliberate provocation or tragic miscalculation. And the public, watching through the haze of headlines, feels an unease it cannot quite name. Deep down, Americans sense that the world has changed. The old certainty that America's might automatically equals moral right no longer holds. That realization is unsettling, but it could also be liberating if it sparks introspection rather than fear. History offers parallels. When Britain faced the Suez Crisis in 1956, it learned that imperial reflexes die hard. The British government, unwilling to accept decline, launched a military intervention in Egypt to reassert control over the canal. The result was humiliation. The empire's twilight became undeniable. The United States now stands at a similar crossroads. The Venezuelan confrontation could be a Suez moment, an event that forces it to acknowledge limits, to trade dominance for cooperation, pride for partnership. Empires that learn humility survive as nations. Those that refuse crumble as relics. Meanwhile, across Latin America, the reaction is electric. From Buenos Aires to Mexico City, commentators speak of dignity reclaimed. Ordinary citizens, many no friends of. The Maduro government still feel a flicker of pride that one of their own dared to stand up to the colossus to the north. It's not about loving Venezuela's leadership. It's about rejecting a history of subordination. For generations, Latin America has been treated as Washington's backyard, a phrase as condescending as it is revealing. The strike turns that metaphor inside out. It says, this hemisphere belongs to all of us, not just to one flag. Now, I am not romanticizing confrontation. Violence always carries tragedy, and escalation could engulf the region. But symbols matter, and the symbol that emerges here is unmistakable. The age of unilateral obedience is ending. Latin America, long fragmented by ideology, is beginning to rediscover a shared purpose to chart its destiny free from external dictates. The Caribbean, once a theater of gunboat diplomacy, may yet become the proving ground of true independence. Let's pull the camera back even further, to the moral theater of global opinion. In Europe, reactions are mixed. Some governments echo Washington's outrage, others urge restraint, fearing another endless conflict that drags NATO into irrelevance. In the Middle East and Africa, leaders privately applaud Venezuela's defiance. They see themselves in its struggle nations, tired of being told how to vote, trade, or think. And in Asia, the event feeds a quiet confidence that the Western era is fading. Each region reads the same story through its own history of humiliation. But here is where we must be careful. The decline of one power does not automatically ensure justice. The rise of others brings its own dangers: authoritarianism, censorship, new hegemonies in different forms. The challenge for humanity is not to replace one empire with another, but to build a system where no nation claims divine right over others. That, I believe, is the lesson hidden within this moment. The Venezuelan strike is not merely an act of defiance. It is a question thrown into the conscience of the world. Can we imagine coexistence without domination? Economically, the stakes are immense. If Washington doubles down with more sanctions, it risks pushing oil markets into chaos. If it threatens military reprisal, insurance rates for global shipping will skyrocket, and the very arteries of world trade, the sea lanes, will constrict. Already, Latin American ports are reporting bottlenecks. Asian importers are scrambling for alternative routes. A regional skirmish could morph into a global supply shock, another link in the chain of inflation, haunting every household from Kansas to Karachi. The moral becomes material. Foreign policy arrogance has domestic cost, and yet there is opportunity buried within this turbulence. Crises can clarify truths long ignored. The U.S. could seize this moment to redefine leadership not as command, but as counsel. It could convene a genuine hemispheric dialogue, admit its own missteps, and embrace cooperation on energy, migration, and climate. That would require courage, the kind of courage that comes not from aircraft carriers, but from moral imagination. The question is whether Washington still possesses that capacity for self-reflection, or whether pride will once again steer policy toward the cliff.